The NFL draft is just over a week away. What's the dream scenario for the Jets? We'll get to it today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, April 17th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangreneNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question is on the NFL draft, and it's fast approaching, just over 1 week away. It's, in fact, a week from tomorrow. The NFL draft gets underway in the first round, and our first mailbag question is, John, realistically, what's your dream scenario for the New York Jets in the 2024 NFL draft? I think realistically is probably the key word there, because the absolute dream scenario that's not realistic is Joe Alt falling to the Jets at 10, or maybe Marvin Harrison Jr. falling to the Jets at 10. We know that that's not going to happen. I think that if I'm stretching here, it would be Rome Odunze falling to the Jets at 10. It kind of feels like Odunze, of the big three receivers, he's the one that could actually make it to the Jets if the Jets don't trade up. Harrison's going to go early. He was never really a consideration once the Jets ended up with the 10th pick. And a lot of the buzz seems to suggest Malik Neighbors is going earlier. Odunze is a guy who I just think has most of the tools you need to be a great receiver. And maybe I could say all the tools you need, because I don't think you need to be great at every single aspect of the receiver position to be a great receiver. I think really the only thing he lacks is like that top end speed, that, the breakaway speed. And yeah, like on some level, that's something the Jets lack at the receiver position. Mike Williams is kind of a slower guy who really leans into his size. Garrett Wilson's not slow, but he's not a burner. He's not a guy who's a threat to take it the distance on every play because he's got so much speed. He's a fast guy. I mean, don't get me wrong. Garrett's got plenty of speed, but not like that breakaway speed. And Dunze would not bring that, but I just think he brings a lot of other attributes to the table. Good size, and he's not slow either. For a guy his size, I think he's actually pretty fast. He's also a guy who's tough to bring down after the catch. A guy who's, I would even say, deceptively fast after the catch. You think a bigger guy like a Dunze may not be that fast, but he's actually he is pretty fast. So yeah, I think it would be a Dunze, and it's kind of funny because I lean in a vacuum towards wanting an offensive lineman over a wide receiver. If you ask me whether I'd rather have generic tackle or generic wide receiver, I'd probably lean towards generic tackle, from the standpoint that the Jets just are in such rough shape in the future at the moment at the tackle position. And they made those signings this offseason, and they made the one signing of Tyron Smith, and they made the trade for Morgan Moses. But those are really stopgap moves. Those are moves that do not address the offensive line in a meaningful way in the long run. And if you look over the horizon for the offensive line, just 1 year from now, I think we can reasonably think Joe Tippmann's going to be a pretty good center. So I think center's okay. AVT at guard, even that's a question mark. I mean, even as somebody who's optimistic about AVT, I think you have to say, at least on some level, he's a question mark. And also it's worth noting that he's entering the final year of his contract. And I don't see how the Jets can pick up his fifth year option. So he's probably going to be a free agent after the year. If you draft a tackle, then it gives you an opportunity to at least have one spot where you feel pretty good in the future at the tackle position. And you have to figure out the other tackle spot. It's, the Jets signed Smith this offseason, and they traded for Moses. You could say, well, they added 2 tackles this offseason. First of all, it's not easy to do. Second of all, let's see how this works out. These 2 tackles are both in their 30s. And I also think adding a tackle would give you some insurance, because you're dealing with 2 of the 5 oldest starting tackles in the league. So I guess built out what I think was a pretty good case for why the Jets should take a tackle. So you might be saying, well, John, didn't you just say you wanted Dunze? I think that should show you how much I think of a Dunze. I think he's gonna be. I think he's gonna be so good that even though I have a slight preference towards the tackle position over the wide receiver position with this 10th pick, Dunze is a guy I think so much of that I would disregard that. Or I don't know if disregard's the right word, but I would. Yeah, I would take wide receiver over tackle, even though in a vacuum, I'd prefer tackle. But if these are the options in front of me, and I like Olu Fashanu quite a bit, I did a whole show on Monday about why I don't think his fall makes a whole lot of sense. But I just like Adunze so much because I think he has so many skills he brings to the table. I think he's gonna be a really good receiver. And I think after Mike Williams leaves next year, Dunze, Garrett Wilson 1-2 punch, or maybe it's a Dunze 1-2 punch would be one of the top duos in the NFL. And you can't deal with everything. You can't figure everything out. I think if Dunze is there, you take him, and you just try and figure out the tackle position some other way. And maybe you just go into the season knowing that tackle position is going to be an issue. It's one of the things about the offseason, especially when you have limited resources like the Jets. You can't really deal with every eventuality. And I still think that if Adunze is there, he'd be a great pick. Next question, John, which draft scenario would make you most upset? I think it might be the trade up. I'm not a fan of the Jets drafting Brock Bowers, but the thing with Bowers is the reason I don't like Bowers is not Bowers himself; it's the position he plays. Tight ends almost never work out when you draft them high, and I think a lot of it has to do with the margin for error. And I've discussed this extensively on the show, but I think it's worth discussing again. So if you're an everyday, you've heard this already, but I think it's worth discussing. Is that there just aren't many tight ends who are 1,000-yard receivers in this league. There were a lot of wide receivers who are. There were 27 wide receivers who went for 1,000 yards last year, only one tight end. Now, in a normal year, maybe there's 2 or 3 tight ends, but it just doesn't happen all that much. So you can have a receiver who's like the 20th best receiver in the league. You pick him, he's still a 1,000-yard receiver. You're off the 20th best tight end in the league. Things aren't going to work out that well for you. And there have been studies that show NFL teams are pretty good at figuring out who the talented players are, but they aren't as good at figuring out who's going to be the best player at their position. They can figure, if you can play, you're probably going to go in the first round. More often than not, the league gets it right on who the good guys are. And that's why that's why the first round produces the most players who are good. But it's very difficult for the league to figure out this guy's going to be the best guy at his position. And that's just a tough thing to do with Bowers. I mean, I think he could be very good. I think the pick could work out, but I don't think it'd be a very good bet for the Jets based on what we know. If you could tell me, if you could give me 100% certainty 5 years down the line, this guy's going to be George Kittle, I'd take him in a second. But I think history shows us that the league has a tough time figuring out who the elite players are, and that's especially true at the tight end position. But that's not my worst case scenario. For me, my worst case scenario is trading up, and it's not necessarily that it would be a bad move. It's just looking over the horizon, looking to the long term. Jets already face challenges with this roster because of how much they've pushed to the present. And it's not that look, if they traded up for Joe Alt, I could live with it. If they traded up for Marvin Harrison Jr., you could talk me into it. But just because I like those players doesn't mean I love the idea of trading up, of parting with even more draft capital for the future. Team building, successful team building in the NFL is not sexy. It requires long-term thinking. It requires using draft picks that the media typically doesn't appreciate. You look at a team that ends up on a long playoff run. More often than not, it's because it nailed its picks, on day 2 of the draft and maybe early day 3 of the draft, and even some later round picks. But at the time those picks were made, nobody was paying a lot of attention to them. Nobody celebrates the second round pick you make. Nobody celebrates the third round pick you make. It doesn't really get a lot of attention. But those picks, if you hit on them, they're the foundation of a good team. And I don't think the Jets can keep giving these picks away. I think the Jets have given away an awful lot of these picks that are important. So, while I wouldn't hate it, I wouldn't hate getting a Marvin Harrison or a Joe Alt, I would dislike the process that gives away even more picks because Jets are already short on these picks. So I think it's the trade up even more than Bowers, because at least with Bowers, like, even though the league does a lousy job of figuring out who the elite talent is, there's a chance Bowers is going to be an elite player. If you trade up, there's no way that pick's coming back. You've just given away another pick. So it's a 100% guarantee you've done something negative. Even if even if there is a positive with it, even if you do get a really good player, you've given away more picks in a situation where you really can't afford to give away more picks. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to who may be leaving. We've talked about who may be coming. We've talked about who the Jets may draft. Which players could be on their way out, though, draft weekend? There are some names we'll mention as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just a jobs board. LinkedIn helps you find professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. If the Jets don't hit on these draft picks, they might be looking for a new GM next year. Maybe they'll use LinkedIn. Well, hopefully not, because hopefully they'll hit on the draft picks. But if they need to, maybe the Jets will turn to LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and may not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. If you like Locked On Jets, you should know Locked On's NFL mock draft is live tonight, April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming on the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on April 17th tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern to hear who the local Locked On experts are picking for each NFL franchise, like me, with live reactions from local college football experts, even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL mock draft tonight, April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming live on Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Today on Locked On Jets, we're having our weekly mailbag show. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's continue. John, do you think the Jets will move any players during the draft? The three that seem most likely are Zach Wilson, John Franklin Myers, and Alan Lazard. However, those seem like pretty difficult players to move. I fully expect Zach Wilson to be traded during the NFL draft. I think that this has played out for a little while because the Jets don't really have any incentive to move Zach Wilson before the draft. If Zach Wilson's on the roster, just taking up a roster spot, well, in the offseason, you get 90 roster spots. So it's not a big deal. I think the Jets are kind of waiting this thing out, hoping that some team, gets desperate, that some team bids against itself. And there's nothing really lost by doing it that way. But it's not going to work. I think we've seen Zach Wilson's market not that good. And we've seen, two quarterbacks from Zach Wilson's draft class get traded this offseason. You have Justin Fields, who has been objectively better than Zach Wilson and only fetched a conditional day 3 pick. Mac Jones, who really hasn't been very good the last couple of years, but did have a rookie season that's better than anything Zach Wilson's done. We only fetched a late round pick. So the market's not very good for Zach Wilson right now. I think it's clear because two quarterbacks who have had more success than Zach Wilson really did not bring a whole lot back. And that speaks volumes. I think that speaks volumes about what Zach Wilson, the Jets can expect Zach Wilson to get. I think that the contract is a sticking point. Any team would need to take on about $5 million in new salary, which nobody's going to want to do for a quarterback like Zach Wilson. But look, I think it's pretty clear the Jets have turned the page. I think it's pretty clear for Zach Wilson, the best thing is to find a new team and get a fresh start. So I fully expect that when the NFL draft comes along, the Jets will make a trade involving him. And I think the reason they're holding out is like right now, probably the best they could do would be first of all, they're going to have to eat some of the salary. And I think, maybe we're talking about a 7th round pick. Maybe we're talking a conditional pick. Maybe we're talking about a pick swap. The price right now is probably not very high. I'm sure there's some team out there that'll put Zach Wilson on the roster. I mean, look, Zach Wilson can make a 53-man roster. As shaky as Zach Wilson's play has been, I'm pretty confident he's good enough to be on an NFL roster next year. But right now, I would imagine the offers the Jets are getting are not very enticing. I think, first of all, the Jets are going to have to eat a lot of salary. And second of all, they're going to, they're not going to get a very big return. So I think the Jets are kind of waiting this out. They're kind of hoping maybe some team will up its offer, and they don't really need to make a move until the 3rd day of the NFL draft. So that's my target date. I think, a week from Saturday, when it's the 3rd day of the draft, that's probably the point where you'll see you'll see Zach Wilson get traded, because that's the point where the Jets either need to make a deal or they're not going to get anything in return. So that's kind of where I'm looking. And I think that's the most likely date, because the Jets are right now. Jets are getting low ball offers, and they're hoping against hope it's going to go up. I think they understand it's not going to go up. That the offers they get aren't going to improve. But I think there's no harm in waiting until you get to the third day of the draft, and then you get past the third day of the draft, you don't get anything for him. So you kind of have to make the move now. That's the point where you have to make the move. Now, how about some of the other players? John Franklin Myers, there are rumblings about him because his cap number is very high. And, earlier in the offseason, I could have seen it. Heading into the offseason, I could have seen it. Even after the Jets signed Jadeveon Clowney, I could have seen it, because Clowney's a guy who kind of replaces him. He kind of take up that role of power end, who sets the edge against the run, and does a lot of the dirty work. Maybe it could happen. I don't think it would be a very good idea for the Jets, though, because JFM is one of those guys who does he does a lot of the dirty work that doesn't always show up in the stat sheet. I think he's a very valuable player to this defense. I mean, Jets play very heavy on the defensive line with JFM in there. Defensive ends and 4-man lines are typically not 280, 290. But because the Jets play bigger, they can get smaller at the linebacker position. They can have a guy like Quincy Williams, who, more of a guy who uses his speed. You can play smaller, faster linebackers when you play bigger on the defensive line, because it prevents the offensive lineman from getting to the second level. And, when you're playing smaller, speedier linebackers, they're not as good at shedding blocks. So you got to keep them clean, and having a bigger defensive line in front of them does that. The Jets traded for Hassan Reddick, but Hassan Reddick's like 240. You're not going to trade for a guy who's 240 to play a power role where one of your jobs is to keep your linebackers clean. So I don't think it'd be a very good idea. I mean, maybe it could happen. I think JFM would have value if the Jets put him on the market, but I think that would be a confusing move, especially, we talk about win now, we talk about all in. Well, that's not a very all in kind of move. It's a kind of move that actually would hurt your defense quite a bit. And Alan Lazard, I mean, look, I'd love to move on from Lazard, but first of all, who's going to want him? And second of all, I don't think Aaron Rodgers is going to sign off on that. And I don't think the Jets are going to cross Aaron Rodgers. I think if Aaron Rodgers wants Lazard here, he's going to be here. I don't think the Jets will stand up to him on that. So I fully expect Alan Lazard to be a member of the Jets next season. Next question, John. Have there been any recent studies as to whether there are more injuries on grass or on turf? I know players blame turf, especially at MetLife, and most fans are on that bandwagon, but I seem to recall seeing that there are some similar numbers on grass. Yeah, so there was a study. It was like a 1-year study that suggested that injuries weren't different between the rate of injury wasn't that different between playing on grass and playing on turf. However, there are other studies that do suggest that turf is a contributor towards injuries. A couple of years ago, the NFLPA put together a study. It was a multi-year study, and I mean they found that the numbers were quite stark on turf. I mean one of the studies that they put out came that noted that there was like a 48% increase on knee, ankle, and foot injuries on turf. There was a 69% increase on just foot and ankle injuries, 32% increase on knee injuries. So there have been studies. There was one recent study that suggested there wasn't a big difference, but there are other studies that have tested a longer period of time that found the rate of injury was much higher on turf than it is on grass. So, to answer the question, yes, there are even, I think I know the study you're talking about, because there was a recent one that I think just looked at like the most recent one season, but there are other multi-season studies that show that there is actually a correlation between playing on turf and a greater number of injuries. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the quarterback position. Should we really be talking about the most important position on the field last on the show? I actually think it can, because I don't think the Jets are going to make any moves at the quarterback position, and I'll explain that in more detail continuing this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Look, we've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure if you or your team can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep. You lift your head up, you say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. You can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball, And you can charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put your game face on, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question. Hi, John. Even assuming Rodgers has a good year or two, what's the Jets' long-term plan at quarterback? Put on your Joe D helmet and you are the GM. What do you do to address life after Rodgers? Well, Joe Douglas, I don't think is focused on that right now. And if we're going to be honest, the Jets don't have a plan past Rodgers. This is, the big two phrases that surround the Jets right now certainly apply to the quarterback position: all in and win now. And they're focused on the here and now. I don't think the Jets really care that they have a 40-year-old quarterback. I think they're focused on 2024, and we'll see what happens in 2025. But I don't think they really care. I think Douglas right now is purely in kind of like self-preservation mode. He knows that Jets don't have a big year this year, that he's going to be fired. So I don't think there's a plan in place. I mean, we know it's not going to be Zach Wilson. The Jets tried to sell Zach Wilson as their long-term quarterback last year, and it never really made sense. I mean, the timeline never really lined up for the Jets, and Zach Wilson had so far to go. The idea that Aaron Rodgers was going to come in and save Zach Wilson's career, I don't think was ever realistic. Aaron Rodgers, first of all, Aaron Rodgers is not a coach, and the coach the Jets brought in, Nathaniel Hackett, is not a good quarterback developer. In addition to other things he's not very good at. So I don't think the Jets were ever really being honest when they talked about Zach Wilson a year ago. I think they claimed that they were going to work that they were going to bring in Rodgers to work with Zach Wilson. I think they claimed that like Rodgers was going to help make Zach Wilson into a starter because it was a way they could sell the Rodgers trade as like a longer term type deal. But I don't think that I don't think that it was ever a realistic hope. And I mean, I don't know who the Jets. I don't know who the Jets' long-term quarterback could be. I mean, it's not going to be Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor's pretty old himself. Maybe they'll draft somebody on day 3 this year, but I don't think that you're going to see the Jets make a move for a longer-term starter. I think they may draft some developmental guy on day 3, and they may sell the guy they draft on day 3 as like their quarterback of the future, but that's nonsense. You don't draft a quarterback on day 3 to be your guy of the future. If you thought he was the guy of the future, you should draft him sooner. Guy you draft on day 3 is somebody you're hoping maybe you strike lightning, so maybe you catch lightning in a bottle. They're probably tools you like in him. It's more of okay, we'll develop this guy, we'll see what happens. It's not we believe this guy's our future. Look, I would be more proactive. I would do things. There are a lot of things I would have done differently over the last 2 years than the way the Jets have done them. I'm a much bigger fan of a more balanced approach to team building than what the Jets have done the last 2 years. So it's a difficult question to ask, like, what would you do? Because I would have done a lot of things differently. Like, I don't think the Jets would be a very different place right now if I was running the team. I'm not saying that like is a good or bad thing. I just think there are things that I would have done differently for this team. But I would be trying to balance the long term and the short run. And I would still consider taking a quarterback in the first round or the third round. I think the Jets will draft a quarterback on day 3, but I would be very interested this year in a quarterback and maybe drafting Rodgers as successor and actually let him sit, pull off the plan they claim they were running with Zach Wilson, let him sit for a couple of years, let him learn from Rodgers, and then have him take over when Rodgers retires. Because right now, the future of this franchise past 2024 or maybe 2025, there are a lot of question marks. And our last question, and it's a very logical follow-up question: which of the tier 2, tier 3 quarterbacks do you think would be most worthy of selection by the Jets? And even though the Jets are most likely not in the market for a quarterback at 10, how do you rate the top quarterbacks in this draft? Meaning in what order and comparison to recent top of the draft quarterbacks? So I like Michael Penix Jr. a lot if we're talking about guys who could be there at 10. I mean, I don't know if I love him at 10. He might be a trade back kind of candidate, but I like the starting experience. I like his ability to read a defense. I'm a little worried about the arm. I mean, I think some of his intermediate throws to the outside are a little labored getting there. I'm not sure, that's the one question I'd have with Michael Penix Jr. is, I just don't know if his arm is big enough for the NFL, but everything else I really like about him. And, again, I don't know if I'd like him at 10, but in a trade back scenario, he'd be a guy who would interest me. I think Bo Nix would also be interesting if we're talking like if he falls a bit or either trade back or if he falls. I wouldn't take Bo Nix anywhere near 10, but I like quarterbacks who have experience. I like quarterbacks who know how to read defenses. I mean, quarterback I think is more of a thinking position than it is a physical position. So I like guys. So I don't think I take either guy at 10. I think trade back, and I think in the case of Knicks, he'd be definitely be a day 2 quarterback for me. But I think if we're talking about gambling on a guy who's going to be there when the Jets pick, I mean, look, Caleb Williams is the best quarterback prospect in this class, but he's not going to be there when the Jets pick. I think it's pretty clear that the top 4 quarterbacks are going to be gone by the time the Jets pick. So I'm not going to include Caleb Williams. I'm not going to include Drake May. I'm not going to include Daniels. I'm not going to include McCarthy. So those guys won't be there when the Jets pick. And to be honest with you, I haven't done a whole lot of work on any of those 4 because I haven't really watched that much of them in detail because there's no chance the Jets are going to be there. So I can't really answer the second question all that well, but I wouldn't have an issue. I wouldn't take either guys at 10, like again, trade back or day 2, but Penix or Knicks, I think, are guys who you get to a certain point in the draft and they might be worth a look because of their starting experience and their knowledge of how to operate within the pocket. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.